postmodernism is a sophisticated philosophy. Now, it's wrong, but it's deeply wrong, but it's not easy to figure out why it's wrong. Now, Marxism, that's a whole different story. I mean, even if it isn't necessarily easy to figure out why it's wrong, the historical evidence that it's wrong is so crystal clear that it's absurd that it even has to be discussed as far as I'm concerned. But you also have to remember with Marxism that if it was wrong, and it was wrong in a very interesting way, because it wouldn't have had the massive influence on people that it had unless there was something about it that was extraordinarily powerful. And it's also the case with postmodernism. It's not like there's no reason that the postmodernists have taken over the universities. Now, there's multiple reasons, but one of them is the intellectual viability of the claims that the postmodernists make. And so I want to present to you what those claims are. And I want to explain to you what about them is correct, because you always have to give the devil his due, you know. You can't assume that your opponents are stupid. And generally, you know, if your opponents are university professors who studied for a very long time, one thing they're not is stupid. You might not agree with what they're doing, and you might not agree with their approach, but they're perfectly capable of formulating coherent arguments. And they're perfectly capable of formulating arguments that stem from a system of underlying axioms and that are logical and difficult to pull apart. So we're going to try to pull them apart a little bit today. So the first thing is, this is the central postmodern claim as far as I can tell. And one of the things I want to tell you is that this is not a specter that only emerged in academia, in the study of literature, for example, because most of the postmodernists were actually literary critics of one sort or another. Not so much philosophers, Jacques Derrida, for example, and Michel Foucault, who are maybe the two people who would be whose names would be most commonly associated with postmodernism, were basically literary critics. And they ran into a problem. And the problem was essentially this. They realized, I would say, perhaps in the late 1960s, that there was a problem with interpreting texts. And the problem is that a text was complicated enough so that it was possible to interpret it in a virtually illimitable number of ways. And that actually constitutes a problem, because if there's no right way of interpreting a text, I mean, look at a text like the Bible. You look at how many different versions of interpretation that text has given rise to it. Of course, everybody claims that their interpretation is correct if they happen to be within their particular sect, let's say. But the fact that it's given rise to so many interpretations is evidence for the postmodernist claim that texts are susceptible to a very large number of interpretations. Now, what I should tell you is about the same time, that problem also emerged in artificial intelligence, oddly enough. It wasn't so much textual interpretation, although that's something that still bedevils artificial intelligence, right? Because one of the things you might want to do with an artificially intelligent system is translation from one language to another. But it turns out that that's a viciously difficult problem, because, you know, you think about any given piece of text, like a paragraph, is you got to get the words have to match one-to-one across the languages, and then the phrases have to match across the languages, and the sentences have to match, and the entire paragraph has to match. And so what human translators do is read the paragraph, understand what it means, and then translate the meaning into the other language. Well, artificial intelligence systems can't do that because they can't figure out what things mean. And so then the question is, well, what is it that you need in order to know what things mean? And the answer to that seems to be something like you need to have a body. I won't talk about that, but that seems to be the emerging consensus on how it is that abstract information in the world is mapped onto something that basically, what will you say, corresponds to a sense of meaning. But anyways, so what the artificial intelligence people discovered at about the same time, by the way, was that it looked, and the behavioral psychologists too, it looked like the world was pretty easy to see. That wasn't a problem. The problem was trying to figure out how to act in the world once you saw the world. So it wasn't hard to interpret the world, it was hard to act in it once you interpreted it. So the artificial intelligence guys tried to make computers, robots, let's say, that could look at the world and then figure out how to act. And what they found out was, well, figuring out how to act wasn't so difficult, but figuring out how to see the world turned out to be impossible, because there are so many ways of seeing it that they're uncountable. I mean, just think about it. I'm looking at this audience. I mean, just think about all the different ways I could see you, you know. I could see you as a homogeneous group. I could see men and women. I could see people with gray hair and people with hair other than gray. I could classify you by color, by the color of your clothing, the color of your shirt, the color of your pants, the color of your socks, your height, your weight. Like, there's an infinite number of ways to parse you apart into intelligible categories. And so then the question is, well, which categories are you supposed to use? And the postmodernists hit that problem in the late 60s, thereabouts, and they thought, well, it isn't obvious. We don't know what the right way of interpreting things are. And then they thought something like, this is an oversimplification, but something like, well, how can we be sure even that what we're teaching our students is correct then? And it's especially problematic in a field like, say, literature. In science, at least in principle, there's a way of anchoring your interpretation to the real world. But in literature, in just general communication, it isn't obvious at all how you make the claim that the interpretation that you're putting forth has any validity other than your opinion. And if it doesn't have any validity other than your opinion, then, well, what's the grounds for your authority in relationship to teaching it? It's something like that. That's a big problem. And the reason it's a big problem is because the central postmodern claim, which is that there is a near infinite number of ways to interpret a text, say, or the world for that matter, actually happens to be true. Now this is where it gets, so fine, so that's a big problem. And the artificial intelligence people have solved that in part by actually starting to build computers with bodies. And so one of the people who did that first was a man named Rodney Brooks, and he's the guy who invented the Roomba, you know, that little thing, that little vacuum cleaner that acts more or less like a really brain-damaged dog. I suppose it has about the same intelligence as a brain-damaged dog, but it doesn't have a central processor or a real brain, but it can still act in the world. It's like a real simple insect, and Brooks was one of the first people who started to attack the problem of the interpretation of the world by making the presupposition that an intelligent organism had to have a body to limit the manner in which it was interpreting the world. And so, anyways, I can't get into that too much because it's so complicated, but the thing you need to know is the postmodernists had a claim, and it's not a trivial claim, and it really undid not only did it undo the teaching of literature, say, it also tended to undo the teaching of philosophy. Now, Derrida was awarded a prize, the name of which I can't remember, at Oxford University back, I believe, in either the mid-70s or something like the early 80s. I think I've got that approximately right. And a lot of the Oxford philosophy dons voted against giving him this prize. But one of Derrida's claims was that his deconstructionist technique had basically invalidated philosophy as such. It's something like that. So it wasn't just literature, it was also philosophy. So, I mean, this is people came across a really hard problem, and that's partly what's been playing itself out in the university. So you need to know that, because you can't just be thinking that this is some trivial problem that just emerged for no reason whatsoever amongst a bunch of radicals. I mean, there's truth in that, and I'll get to that, but that's not the only issue. The issue is, how do you know that your interpretation of something complex is correct?
That was an excerpt from the Rebel Live conference. For the entire program, go to therebellive.com.